The moment Simone Croft looked at Cade Marlowe's hands, the engine grease that had settled into the lines of his knuckles and wouldn't come all the way out, no matter how long he'd stood at the garage sink before walking over to pick up his daughter, and said, in a voice that carried across the whole of the Birch Street diner, "I'd think a man in your position would know better than to keep people waiting." Nobody moved. In Heron Cove, you didn't push back against Croft development, not anymore. Not since the company had come up from Toronto 18 months ago, with its consultants and its renderings and its promises about waterfront revitalization, and not since half the town council had started returning Simone Croft's calls before they returned anybody else's. But at a corner table near the window, a man in a gray wool cardigan had already set down his newspaper. Cade had promised Ada the diner for her report card. It was their tradition, the same way everything in their life had become their tradition since Becca died 3 years ago. Carved out deliberately, held to carefully, because routines were the thing that kept a 9-year-old's world from feeling like it was always at risk of shifting. Ada had come home on Friday with the envelope, and she hadn't opened it in front of him. She'd gone to her room and come back out 2 minutes later with the expression she wore when she was trying very hard not to smile, and she'd set the envelope on the kitchen table and said, "I think we should go to the Birch Street." He'd looked at the envelope. "That confident? I have thoughts about dessert." She'd gotten straight A's, including an A+ in the science unit on mechanical systems that she'd stayed up 3 nights working on because she wanted to understand it properly, not just well enough to pass. He'd helped where she'd let him, which wasn't always. She was 9 and already particular about when help was useful and when it was just noise. Cade had closed the garage early. He'd washed his hands twice at the sink, gotten the worst of it, put on a clean flannel shirt, and walked the 4 blocks to Ada's school. She'd come through the doors with her backpack on one shoulder and her coat half-zipped because she always forgot the bottom half, and she'd said, "We're going, right? You said we're going." We're going. The Birch Street diner sat at the corner of Birch and Elgin, 2 blocks from the post office, and directly across from the hardware store that had been there since before most current residents had been born. It had vinyl booths and laminated menus and a chalkboard on the back wall that listed daily soups in handwriting that belonged to Gordy Turcotte, who had run the place for 26 years and made a point of being in the kitchen for every lunch service because he believed, as a matter of genuine conviction, that the food was better when he was watching. Ada had a booth she preferred, the one in the corner with the window that looked out toward the lake. They'd been coming here since she was 6. Terry, who'd been waitressing her way through her 3rd year at Georgian College and always brought Ada extra crackers without being asked, spotted them from the counter and waved. Cade ordered coffee. Ada began the serious work of evaluating the dessert menu, which she always consulted first, because in her view the dessert was the context that made the rest of the meal make sense. "The apple crisp," she said. "It says it's seasonal. Everything in diners is seasonal." She looked up at him with the expression she'd inherited entirely from Becca, patient, faintly amused, unconvinced. "That's not what seasonal means. It means Gordy found a good deal on apples." She went back to the menu. He drank his coffee and let himself be still for a moment, which was not something that came easily on most days. 3 years of running a 2-man garage, 1 man, most of the time, since Dale worked half weeks, now that his knees had started giving him trouble, had a way of making stillness feel like something you had to earn. He'd been a senior structural engineer at an automotive plant in Oshawa before they moved here. 15 years designing components that had to hold together under conditions that would destroy lesser materials. He'd been good at it. He'd also been, for most of those 15 years, the kind of father who sent voice messages from the plant floor and made it home in time for bedtime only when the line hadn't run long. Becca had been the one who said, before the diagnosis, and then more urgently after, that he had to choose what he wanted the shape of his life to be, because the shape you built in the middle years was the one you lived with at the end of them. He'd chosen the garage. He'd chosen Heron Cove. He'd chosen the kind of work that ended when he closed the bay doors and started again when he opened them. He still thought she'd been right. He thought it most on Friday afternoons, in vinyl booth diners with his daughter and a lukewarm coffee. The bell above the door was what interrupted it. Simone Croft came in the way people came in when they had never once in their lives had to consider whether they were welcome somewhere. She was in her mid-30s, dressed in the particular way of people who spent time in cities and wanted small towns to feel the weight of that distinction. A long charcoal coat, leather bag, boots that weren't built for November sidewalks. 2 people trailed behind her. A younger woman in a puffer jacket holding a phone in both hands, and a man in a sport coat who scanned the room the way people did when they'd been trained to categorize environments quickly. She assessed the diner in about 4 seconds. Her eyes moved to the corner booth, Cade and Ada's booth, and stopped. Terry appeared. "Hi there, welcome in. We've got a bit of a wait right now, but there are spots at that table." Simone Croft's voice was pleasant, which was the thing that made it immediately clear she wasn't asking. "The corner one. That table's occupied. I can get you." "I can see it's occupied." She was already moving toward them. "I need the light. It won't be long." Cade looked up when he heard the heels stop beside his booth. Ada was still reading the menu. He registered the coat, the posture, the way the assistant materialized half a step behind, and he set down his mug carefully, the way he set down tools when he was thinking about something else. "Excuse me." Her voice carried that same smooth, even tone, the voice of someone who found directness more efficient than courtesy. "I need this table." "We haven't ordered yet." "I understand that." She glanced at Ada, then back at him. "How long do you think you'll need?" "We just got here." A slight pause. The first crack in the pleasantness, thin as a hairline fracture. "I have a client meeting in 20 minutes. This is the only table with adequate light and reception." Another pause. "I'm sure Gordy can find you something comparable." "I'm sure he can too," Cade said. "But we're sitting here." The crack widened. She looked at him the way you looked at something that wasn't cooperating with physics, briefly confused, then rearranging into a kind of settled patience that was its own form of contempt. Her eyes moved to his hands on the table, stayed there a moment. "What is it you do?" "Not curious, calibrating." "Mechanic." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she'd already determined. "Right." A glance at his shirt, his hands again. "Do those actually wash?" she said, quietly, which was somehow worse than if she'd said it loud. "Or is that just how mechanics come?" The diner was silent enough, now that you could hear the coffee machine cycling behind the counter. Ada had gone still. She'd put the menu down. Her hands were in her lap, and Cade could feel without looking the specific quality of her stillness. The kind that meant she was holding something in. The kind he'd learned to recognize at 2 a.m., when she used to wake from nightmares and try to convince him she'd been fine the whole time. That was the thing that did it. Not the comment about the table. Not the calculated weight she'd put behind her company's name. The thing was his daughter sitting across from him, straight A's in her bag, 9 years old, trying very hard not to let a stranger see what her face was doing. He looked at Ada, not Simone Croft. "Bud." His voice came out level and quiet. "You want to tell me what you're thinking for the main?" Ada looked up at him. Something shifted in her expression, an assessment, a decision. The grilled cheese. "Good call. I'm getting the soup." He looked at Simone Croft the way you looked at something when you'd decided it wasn't worth additional energy. Not angry, not cold, just done. "You're welcome to wait at the counter." 3 full seconds of silence. Then Simone Croft took a slow breath, pulled out her phone, and made a call in a voice too low for anyone nearby to hear. But she kept her eyes on Cade the entire time. What happened next, Cade mostly didn't see. Gordy Turcotte came out of the kitchen. He was a broad-shouldered man who had played senior hockey until his 40s and still moved like someone who didn't require much space. He walked past Simone without stopping, came to Cade's table, and stood with his arms crossed. "Lunch is on the house today," Gordy said. Cade started to object. Gordy shook his head once, the way he did when a conversation was already over, and went back to the kitchen. Terry brought Ada extra crackers without being asked. The man in the corner booth, wool cardigan, newspaper, soup going cold, had not made any visible movement during the exchange. He was in his late 60s, silver-haired, with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had spent a long time learning that watching carefully was more useful than reacting quickly. His name was Walter Drummond. He'd retired 2 years ago after 16 years as a provincial integrity commissioner and before that 9 years in the office of the Auditor General. He had reviewed the files of 4 municipalities and contributed to the prosecution of 6 elected officials over a career that had made him, in certain circles, exactly the kind of person developers with flexible ethics learn to recognize and avoid. He had been eating lunch at the Birch Street Diner on Fridays for 18 months, ever since moving to Heron Cove to be closer to his daughter after his wife passed. He'd heard the rumors about the Croft Development waterfront project and had been watching them with the attentiveness of a man who knew what certain patterns of rumor usually preceded. He finished his soup. He folded his newspaper. He left a 20 on the table. Outside on Birch Street, he stood in the November cold for a moment, then dialed a number he hadn't used in 8 months. The call was answered on the second ring, a woman's voice, younger than his, precise. "Commissioner, I thought you retired." "I did," Walter said. "I'm calling as a private citizen. Are you recording?" A brief pause. "Give me a minute." He gave her 90 seconds because he was thorough by practice. Her name was Priya Siddiqui. She was the deputy director of the Provincial Integrity Commissioner's Office, and she had been one of the 2 best investigators Walter had ever trained. He told her what he'd witnessed the same way he'd always filed witness accounts: names, times, direct quotes, behavior, context. He described the employees' responses when the Croft name surfaced, Terry's retreat, the way a couple 2 tables over had looked at each other and gone quiet. He described the implied threat, never explicit, always structured carefully enough that everyone in the room understood its weight. He described the mechanic sitting with his daughter, the quality of his response, the fact that his daughter had gone still, and that her father had seen it and had chosen her instead of the confrontation. "We've had a file on the Heron Cove waterfront deal for 7 months, Priya said when he finished. "A council member with a direct financial interest in the land acquisition. Testimony we couldn't sufficiently corroborate." Walter watched a pickup truck roll slowly down Birch Street, a dog in the back, ears flat against the wind. "What do you need?" he asked. "A thread," she said. "Something to pull." He pulled his coat closed. "I'll give you a formal statement this week." Cade didn't know any of this. He drove Ada home through the early dark of a November evening, listening to her explain at considerable length why the grilled cheese had been exceptional, and specifically what had made it exceptional, which turned out to involve a theory about cheese-to-bread ratios that had its own internal logic. He didn't think about Simone Crofton until he was washing dishes that night, and Ada was reading at the kitchen table. He thought about the specific way she'd looked at his hands, not even with cruelty exactly, more like reflexive assessment, the way you looked at something to determine its value before deciding how much attention it deserved. He'd been looked at that way before. The plant had been full of people who'd learned to read other people's clothes and job titles before deciding how much time they were worth. He'd done it himself, once, though he was not proud of that now. What he hadn't been prepared for was Ada seeing it. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair undone. "She looked at your hands," Ada said. He turned from the sink. "Yeah, she did." Why? He thought about how to answer honestly without handing her something heavier than she needed to carry at 9 years old. "Some people use what a person does for work as a measure of how much they're worth," he said, "like a shortcut, instead of taking the time to actually figure it out." Ada was quiet for a moment. "That's a bad shortcut." "It's a very bad shortcut." She came into the kitchen and sat at the table, not going to bed yet, despite the pajamas. "I wasn't going to cry," she said. "I just wanted you to know that." "I know. I was deciding not to." "You did a good job." She pulled her knees up to her chest. "I kept thinking about what you told me, about how Mum said the kind of person you are shows in the small stuff, not the big stuff." He dried his hands on the dish towel, sat down across from her. "I think the way you talked to her was the small stuff," Ada said. "You didn't make it big. You just stayed." He looked at his daughter, 9 years old, sitting in the kitchen at 9:30 on a Friday, working something out. Yeah, he said. That's about right. She unfolded from the chair. Okay, I'm going to sleep. At the doorway, she stopped. Dad, your hands are fine. He looked at them. The stain that never quite came out, the calluses along the palm, the particular shape of hands that had spent years on engines, and before that on engineering drawings, and before that on whatever a 22-year-old reached for when he was still figuring out who he was going to be. Thanks, Bud. She went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table in the quiet for a while. He thought about Becca the way he often did on Friday nights. She would have had something to say about the afternoon, something that cut to the center of it without making it more than it was. She'd had that ability. He missed it in a way that had changed shape over 3 years, but hadn't gotten smaller. He thought she would have said, "You stayed yourself. That's the whole job." He went to bed. What came next happened without him. Over the following 2 weeks, Priya Siddiqui's office made contact with 3 witnesses whose names had appeared in the Heron Cove development file without resolution. A former assistant town planner who had flagged an irregularity 18 months ago and been quietly shuffled to a different department. A local real estate agent who had watched a parcel of waterfront land sell to a numbered company at a price that didn't match the market and then reappear in the development proposal at a significantly higher value, benefiting the brother-in-law of the deputy mayor. A municipal councilor who had voted in favor of the Croft rezoning application despite a conflict of interest he had not declared. The story appeared in the Collingwood Enterprise first, then was picked up by the Grey Bruce regional outlets, then by a Toronto Papers Ontario desk. The headline was measured, "Integrity Office opens probe into Heron Cove waterfront deal following complaint." The subheading was less so. Witnesses break silence after years of alleged pressure. The Birch Street Diner was mentioned in the 3rd paragraph, described as the setting of an incident that had prompted a long-time integrity official to come forward with a formal complaint. No names of private citizens were included. Walter Drummond was referenced only as a retired public official who had submitted a witness account. Cade read the article on a Tuesday afternoon while eating a sandwich in the garage office. He read it twice. Then he set his phone on the workbench and finished his sandwich. His sister Lorraine called that evening. "You have to have seen it," she said. "I saw it. The Birch Street thing, that was you. That was you and Ada at the diner." An older man made a phone call. That's what started it. Cade. She said his name the way people said names when they wanted them to function as an argument. "We had lunch," he said. "Ada got the grilled cheese. That's the whole of what I did." She was quiet a moment. "Reporters are going to call." "Probably." "What are you going to do?" He looked through the garage window at the bay where Dale had left the transmission job half finished. "I'm going to finish the transmission tomorrow and pick up Ada at 3:30. Lorraine made a sound that contained several things at once: frustration, affection, the particular resignation of someone who had known him for 39 years, and understood this was simply the way he was built. "Pass it along to anyone who asks," he said. "We're fine." The Croft development deal was suspended pending the investigation's findings. 2 council members stepped aside. Simone Croft issued a statement through her company's communications team that did not address what had happened at the Birch Street Diner. Gordy Turcotte did not put a sign in the window. He did quietly replace the booth cushions at the corner table, which had needed it for 2 years. On the 2nd Saturday of December, Cade walked into the Birch Street Diner with Ada, who had already decided on the apple crisp before they arrived. Terry brought their drinks without being asked. Gordy came out of the kitchen, arms crossed, stood at the end of their table long enough to nod once at Cade and ruffle Ada's hair, which she tolerated because Gordy was one of approximately 4 people she allowed that from. "Cold out," Gordy said. "Cold out," Cade agreed. Gordy went back to the kitchen. Ada poured her hot chocolate and looked out the window at the gray December street, the hardware store across the road, the bare trees along the median, the lake 2 blocks over sitting flat and pewter-colored under a low sky. "I've been thinking," she said. "Okay. About what I want to be, for work." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I know I'm 9. I wasn't going to say it. I want to do something where you can actually see that it matters, not just be told it does. He thought about that. About 15 years of engineering work that had mattered in ways he'd never been able to point to directly. About 3 years of garage work that Ada had grown up watching. The specific and visible satisfaction of a car that ran right when it hadn't before. "What did you want when you were 9?" she asked. "I wanted to understand how things worked." "Did you figure it out?" "Some things." She considered this. Outside, a pickup slowed at the intersection and turned toward the waterfront. "I think," Ada said, "the thing that matters most is how you treat people when you don't have to be kind." He looked at her. "Mrs. Brennan said that in class, but I think it's true." The December light came in flat through the diner windows, the same gray light it had always been. Terry brought Ada's apple crisp. It was, as advertised, seasonal, and it was very good. And Ada ate it with the concentrated pleasure of someone who had been thinking about it all week and found that the reality matched the anticipation exactly, which was rarer than people admitted. Which was, when it happened, more than enough.